Stipko Live. Welcome back to New York City. On Skype with us from somewhere in the upper northeast, Charles Faddis, retired CIA super dude and formerly in charge of the Weapons of Mass Destruction Unit and several other things in the Central Intelligence Agency. Now author of Codename Aphrodite, most recent literary piece from Charles. How are you, Charles?
Doing very well.
Good to see you there. You turned me on to Buddy Roemer, which we can talk about maybe in another segment, but this is a presidential candidate who actually, not many people have heard of, but he's showing some promise, and I don't know about you, but I kind of feel good about some of his policies and procedures that he's laying out. Not to mention the fact that the guy's got, a full-bodied background behind him. He's Senate, congressional, he's a governor of Louisiana. I mean, guys, he's formidable, I think. Too bad nobody's heard of him.
Yeah, I agree. I think look, he at least deserves a good look, huh?
Yeah, we're going to give him a good look. There's more of that to come. So the lead story on Ann Magazine, which is your story, nice work by the way, it's called Egypt's Bolsheviks, and I'm going to read a quote from that, and I want you to give me a little background on what led up to this, which was basically a frantic message that was sent to the Tsar Nicholas himself from the president of the Duma. Here's how it reads. Situation serious. Anarchy in the capital. Government paralyzed. Transport of food and fuel in full disorder. Popular discontent growing. Disorderly firing in the streets. Some military units fire on one another. Essential immediately to order persons having the confidence of the country to form a new government. Delay impossible. Any delay deadly. I pray to God that in this hour the blame does not fall on the crown. Tell me about this message, and this is back in 1917. What happened?
Right, so I think that most people, when they think about the Russian Revolution, which is what we're talking about all they think about is that, if they know anything about it at all, is that there was a revolution and the communists ended up in control, and then we have the Soviet Union and 7-8 decades of communist rule. But when the revolution actually occurred, the first revolution in 1917, it was really a popular uprising, almost a spontaneous thing. It occurred in St. Petersburg or Petrograd, which was then the capital of Russia. And the workers came out. It was a desperate time. Food was short, prices terrible, the First World War's dragging on. The streets filled with people. The government loses control. There's anarchy. And ultimately, the president of the Duma, which was sort of a parliament that had been created,
right,
he sends a message to the Tsar saying, effectively, everything's going to hell in a handbasket. We need you to get in here and try to save the situation. So the Tsar attempted to do that. Was unsuccessful, couldn't even get into the country. So the Tsar being the emperor of Russia.
Wow.
And the government disintegrated, and what you were left with then was not a communist government, but a government run by the Duma, which was a parliamentary body, and they actually enacted a whole series of reforms, universal suffrage, direct ballot voting for all offices, the vote to women, the vote to everybody, regardless of property. I mean, in many ways, they became overnight one of the most progressive democratic governments in the world. And actually, the United States stood up and cheered, by the way.
Right. And this is all between 1917, 1923, right in that range? Well,
this is sort of from February to the fall of 1917.
Wow, okay. Right in the
beginning. Literally, the first country on earth to recognize this new Russian Republic was the United States of America. So my point here is that this is really, I use this expression in the article, this is the Russian Spring, right? This is everybody in the world talking about, my God, how beautiful things have become in Russia. And as we know from history, what happened was, in fall of that same year, the Bolsheviks, the Communist Party, came in, and despite the fact that they did not represent the majority of the people, seized control and took that entire nation off in a completely different direction for 70 plus years.
All right, so connect the dots for the common man who doesn't have quite the historical references in their brain that you do. Connect the dots between the current situation in the Arab Spring with what you're defining as sort of the Russian Spring of 1917. Who is which player now? I mean, which is Al Qaeda, which is government heads, and so on.
Right. So what we're seeing now in Egypt, as we're beginning to move into the first round of voting for a parliament post Mubarak now, is that all of a sudden the parties that are dominant are hardline Islamic parties in Egypt. About 40% of the vote is going to the Muslim Brotherhood, which has been associated with all sorts of radical Islamic organizations across the Middle East for decades.
Right.
But actually, these guys are not in this spectrum, on this continuum. There are people much further out on the hardline spectrum even to them. So there is a Salafi party called Al-Nur, which means the dawn, that's getting 20 to 25% of the vote, a quarter of the vote, let's say. These guys, their program is effectively indistinguishable from that of Al-Qaeda. I mean, the caliphate, this mythical Islamic world that Al-Qaeda is always talking about creating, well, that's precisely the objective of these guys who are currently polling 25% of the vote, 25% of the vote.
Wow. And the Salafi that you talk about, are there other factions or other sort of variations of that are less radical, or is anything that's Salafi radical fundamentalist Muslim? And are they all Sunni also, by the way?
All of these guys are Sunnis.
Okay.
All of the Salafis are going to be way out on the very hard line end of the spectrum. Now, some of them are probably going to tell you that they favor nonviolent jihad of some sort.
Right.
But all of these guys, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Salafis, highly organized, highly disciplined. And the point of my article that I wrote that you were referencing earlier is to say, look, when you're in this kind of chaotic situation, we may wish that sweetness and light rose to the top and that's what drove things. But just as in Russia, where things end up being controlled by the guys who are the most ruthless, the most organized, and the most disciplined.
And minority as well.
And a minority.
Right.
Increasingly, that's looking like exactly what's happening in Cairo and in Egypt. These guys have a huge following, the Islamic parties, in the slums and amongst poor Egyptians.
Right.
And they are well on their way to seizing control of this new government.
Let me ask you, in Syria, last time I was in Syria and speaking with people in and around some of the outlining areas, and I asked them about, as softly and safely as I could, I asked them about Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah and some of these various factions that are sort of infiltrating in various areas. And, the underlining response I got from a lot of them was, they came, they gave us money, they gave us weapons to defend ourselves. It's a win-win for us. We don't care about anyone outside of Syria. Long live Syria and the hell with everybody else. They weren't looking for trouble, but they were also accepting basically funding and defense weaponry, if you will, from these. Is that kind of the similar situation? I mean, in the Russian Revolution, did the smaller faction come in and overpower, or did they sort of feed them supplies and sort of entice them into support, or did they just brutally take it over?
Well, I think the answer is they did a combination of things. But the point is that whatever they're doing, they're very disciplined, they're very organized, they're very methodical. These guys are not drifting along. They have a very clear plan. I mean, the Bolsheviks had a very crystal clear plan as to what they were doing in Russia. The Salafis now have an equally clear plan.
So you defined the Russian Spring and then the Russian Fall earlier. Would you say that we're getting ready for an Arab Fall in Egypt following the Arab Spring?
Yeah, quite likely, unfortunately.
Sort of the calm before the storm?
Well, and here's the irony, it's only been months since everybody in the administration is trumpeting the fact that this whole Arab Spring movement means the downfall of Al-Qaeda's ideology, and that, nobody's going to listen to Al-Qaeda anymore because Al-Qaeda says you have to do this through violence. Well,
yeah, that's laughable.
It doesn't really matter much how you get there if the end result is you're left with a government in charge which is going to impose precisely what Al-Qaeda wanted.
Right.
I made a brief reference a little while ago. There's another immediate practical piece to this. These guys have a very fanatical attitude toward imperialism and toward Israel. The linchpin of the Middle Eastern peace process, to the extent that it exists, has been since the Camp David Accords decades ago, that Egypt and Israel are at peace. So while we still haven't managed to crack the code on getting to complete peace, we have ended the era of wars between Israel and its neighbors, largely, except for Hezbollah,
right,
because the Egyptians made peace, and that's it. Well, both of these Salafi movements, both of these Islamic movements I've been talking about, are on record as saying they think they need to take another look at those accords and decide whether they're going to abide by it.
Which is clearly a soft and gentle implication that they're going to unwind that peace and maybe get a little more active, wouldn't you say?
Whether they're going to whether they're going to launch an invasion, that's another thing.
Right.
But they're certainly not going to be any longer partners in a peace process and trying to get to. Potentially this is all disastrous. Potentially this leaves us in a horrible situation.
How does it leave the United States in a horrible situation, other than just the humanity perspective? I mean, strategically and politically, how does that leave us?
Well, I mean, let's talk about sort of what I think is realistically the worst thing that could happen. So we end up with a hardline Islamic government in control in Egypt.
Right.
So Egypt now ceases to be. So what you now have is a nation that's going to begin, first of all, to impose socially, politically, all of these attitudes. So you're going to have the equivalent of Saudi Arabia in terms of segregation of sexes, attitude toward women. The tourist industry, of course, is going to go away.
Wow.
But you're also going to have a country that is no longer lined up as a secular nation with the United States in support of peace and progress in the Middle East. You're going to have a hostile government in Cairo, which thinks, that's great that this has happened in Egypt. That's the first step. We need to transform the rest of the Middle East, which means the expulsion of all Western influence. What these guys want is a return to this mythical time in like 600 A.D. when they believe Islam was completely pure and devoid of contact with the West. That's what they're looking for.
Right. And it's funny, you can walk the streets. Well, I haven't in recent months, but a year or two ago, you can walk the streets in Egypt and some of those surrounding areas, and you'll see all kinds of Western influence, from music to the clothing to food to commerce. And you think that what these guys are looking for is a real hardline, like you said, expulsion of anything Western influenced.
If you look at, it's interesting, if you look at Egyptian film, because Egypt in the Arab world has a very robust film industry.
Absolutely, yeah.
And if you look at Egyptian films, as you may well have, from the 50s and the 60s, what you see is an incredibly secular society, the way it's being portrayed on film. I mean, this is not pornography, but I mean, women are dressed largely in clothes like you would expect to see in suburban America.
Right.
Men and women are socializing, dancing.
Right.
This is the image that they were projecting on film. Wouldn't necessarily reflect the reality everywhere, but it was acceptable and where they all expected to be going. Wow. Yeah. First of all, films will be forbidden if the Salafis are in charge.
Right. Yeah. Film gone, internet gone, pretty much any of that. That is kind of frightening. Where would you say Mubarak was in that hardline scale? If 0 was not hardline, and 10 is what Salafi is looking to achieve, where would you say Mubarak's regime was?
In terms of Islamic influence, I mean, way down at the low end of the scale. 2, I don't know. I mean,
way down.
Now, I mean, the factor, the sort of wild card here is, of course, the Egyptian military, which is a very secular institution and is making noises that it may, serving notice that it may or may not allow Egypt to veer too far into this Islamic orbit. But, our administration has pretty much put itself on record that the military in Egypt needs to get out of the business of intervening. So we could find ourselves basically in this crazy situation in which you could have a Salafi government hostile to the United States, in control, driving Egypt in the direction of being hostile to the United States. And our official policy would be to tell the Egyptian military to leave them alone and let them do that, because...
Where's the logic behind that? I don't understand the logic. Like, why would we, we make mistakes, but we're not typically foolish. That sounds really foolish. Why would we do something like that?
I think that, we're all obviously committed to democracy in the United States. Sure. I always use the expression that, it's not true we don't have a state religion. Our state religion is democracy. It's the lifeblood of this country.
Sure.
But we have a nation that's, our democracy is based obviously on centuries of civil society and democratic rule and the evolution of to a country that can handle that process. I think sometimes Americans naively assume that you institute democracy anywhere in the world and the result is going to have to be the best of all possible worlds. And in fact, in a lot of places, what you're going to get is something pretty ugly. It's going to be a process that gets abused, and what's going to emerge from it is not going to be the best possible government. So I think there's a lot of that naivete in Washington, where they just assume, if this comes out of this democratic process, this Salafi movement, then that must be what's best for Egypt. So leave it alone.
Of all of the governmental groups here in the United States, does everyone know what's potentially looming beneath the surface here, or is it are some just oblivious to it, or what's the motivation? What's the intelligence level?
I've had a bunch of conversations with people recently, and whether it's the Department of State or the intelligence community, and I think across the board there is a really keen awareness of how dangerous this situation is.
Right.
I don't know whether that's going to make any difference to this administration's approach. From the beginning of these demonstrations, they have been very enthusiastic about jumping on this fiction that this is all about a bunch of people who want a secular, liberal, democratic future in the Middle East.
Right.
And I'm not saying there aren't people like that. That's not my point.
Right.
My point is to say that that's not. It's a much more complex, more dangerous situation than that.
Yeah, and it seems, other than some of the spokespersons that make statements after events like the capture of Osama bin Laden and so on, it seems that people like President Obama and other high-profile leaders are very cautious about saying everything is done and fine and we're all great because we caught a couple people and the ideology of al-Qaeda is now gone and we're all fine. Seems like at the very least they're cautious about saying anything like that, more than typical politicians are even cautious, which is, I think, is a little indicative of them knowing that there's more than meets the eye with this calm before the storm.
I don't think, honestly, probably the best way to characterize it now is they don't know what to do.
Right.
They have endorsed this process. They have jumped on it. They sort of own it now, but it is not evolving the way they envisioned that it would evolve.
Wait, are you saying our governmental leaders?
Our government has, we've jumped into this now, and now we're stuck with the results. We can't really now say, having endorsed this process, we don't like the results.
Right. In the same vein, Charles, would you say that the guys that are up and coming in Egypt are getting the same results that they're looking for, or following the steps that they've been looking to follow? Is it working for them? Do they feel that way?
Yeah, I think so. And I think one of the things that's really telling is when you look at interviews with the major leaders in the Salafi Party and the Muslim Brotherhood, whenever they're talking to the Western press in particular, they're very reticent. They speak, very limited in their commentary, and because They understand that they're raising a lot of concerns, and they're not quite sure whether we are or are not really going to stand back.
Right.
So they're keeping their own counsel.
Right. They don't know if we're on to them, is what you're saying.
They're trying not to rock the boat because they're thinking, look, if this plays out the way it looks like it's going to play out, we're going to own this place in the very near future, at which point we can do anything we want.
Right. They're strategizing.
So let's just stay low right now. Don't make a lot of claims as to what we're going to do. So they get interviewed all the time now, the Salafis, about, so what are you going to do about, I mean, your policies are very clear. Women have to stay at home. Women and men can't socialize. Women shouldn't work. All these kinds of things. And what you get are just these very innocuous, evasive kind of responses. Just
to anyone in the know, that is a response unto itself.
These are guys whose campaign, they actually have some female candidates, but their female candidates are forbidden from having their faces on campaign posters because that's anti-Islamic. So you have to have a picture of a flower to represent you if you're a woman.
Okay. So, it sounds like a bit of a Bad Moon Rising song here, Charles. Is there anything, any bright outlook, any silver lining to this cloud?
Well, I'm going to be a little cautious with this because this is not a particularly great or clean response.
Right.
But Turkey went through a period for decades where the military sort of functioned as sort of guarantors of the Constitution, and at strategic moments intervened in political affairs.
Right.
And there are pluses and minuses to that, and I'm not trying to sit here and say that I'm in favor of military dictatorships, but I think what it did was it took Turkey through a period of time where they were basically learning how to handle democracy, and then finally the military has completely backed out of affairs in Turkey.
Right.
Some such compromise in Egypt might provide the stability that they need. A military regime that would say, look, we're going to let you guys run the shop, but within certain limits. You're not going to go any further than this in this direction. You're not going to go any further than that. Now, if we can reach that agreement, we'll leave you alone. If not, we're going to step in. That's not clean. It's not pretty. It's not the way Americans want it, but it might be the best thing for Egypt.
All right. Charles Faddis, the cover story, Egypt's Bolsheviks, on Ann Magazine right now. Thanks for coming on Stipko Live. As always, I enjoy having you. We're short on time. But I got one fluff question for you, if you don't mind. There's a series that's running right now on, I think it's Showtime, called Homeland with Claire Danes and some other actors. Have you seen any of it? Do you know much about it?
I haven't seen any of it. I've heard lots and lots of people talking about it, and so I got it on my list that I got to check out because it's supposed to be pretty good.
Yeah, so I've heard from other people that work in, under your former employer's roof, that it's pretty damn accurate in a lot of ways. Have you heard kind of the same thing?
I have heard that, and that's one of the things that's got me so I could check it out.
Yeah, definitely check it. I've seen it, and the best thing you could do is watch, if you can, watch the 6 episodes coming up to this Sunday's season finale. It's a short season. They started it halfway, but definitely worth seeing, and we have Claire Danes coming up on an interview shortly as well. Charles, codename Aphrodite, find it on Amazon.com. Definitely worth the read. Thanks again, bud.
Thank you.
All right, that's Stipko Live for today. We'll see you next time.